great to see all of y'all. I'll introduce myself while the last of us find our seats. My name is Matt Tollander. I'm one of the pastors here on staff at Midtown. Really privileged to serve this church, and I'm really excited because this morning we are starting a new teaching series that we're going to be in for 3 weeks, where we're going to be looking at a few of the parables of Jesus together. And unfortunately, we can't spend the next year going through each and every parable, although that would be kind of awesome. But we're going to cover 3 of Jesus' lesser-known parables in this series. So this is going to be deep tracks only, okay, no hits. But if this series sparks your interest, and you want to study the parables more deeply, if you'd rather read a book than comb through all the slop on the internet to figure that out, then I just want to tell you right up front, people often come up and ask me for resources and stuff after sermons, so I'm just going to put them right up front for you. 2 of the best books on parables that you can read. The first one is called Stories with Intent by Klyne Snodgrass, one of the most thorough, comprehensive books on the parables. It's a little academic, and so it's a little dense. And so if you want something a little bit easier to read, another fantastic book on parables, one of my favorite books of all time, this one, Kingdom, Grace, and Judgment by Robert Capon. Load-bearing stuff for me in my faith ever since I read it when I was in seminary. So I can't recommend those 2 books to you enough. And before we dive into our parable this morning, I just want to talk a little bit about parables in general and what parables are. Jesus taught in parables a lot, and a lot of his most famous teachings come from his parables. And even if you're not a church person, you're still kind of familiar with at least some of his parables because some of them have become staples in our cultural vernacular. And so you've heard of a Good Samaritan, or a prodigal son, or a pearl of great price, or a house built on sand. Jesus teaches in parables as a way of trying to give his hearers a lens through which they can see reality clearly. Often when we look at parables, we look at them one at a time, and they can appear to us like little fables. But they're not exactly fables, but they're Jesus' way of trying to change our lens and trying to get us to think about God in a different way and to see God's world a different way. And very often this involves subverting expectations and using what Kierkegaard called indirect communication. So, rather than saying what he means in a very straight-ahead way, just conveying dry information, Jesus likes to package his point within these provocative images and stories that get the gears turning in the minds of his hearers. And so, parables are they're more than just an illustration. It's hard to pin down an exact definition of a parable because they're also different, and you can sort them into many different categories. But C.H. Dodd offers this definition, which is pretty good. He says this. He says, at its simplest, the parable is a metaphor or a simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. So in other words, parables are not these straight-ahead teachings about how to live life. They're not like proverbs. They're not moral fables for application. They're meant to change the way that we think about God, and they're meant to even disturb us a little bit in the process. And this morning we're going to look at the parable that many have called the most difficult parable, the hardest parable, the most complex knot to untie. I don't know if the name Rudolf Bultmann probably does not mean anything to you. He was a very important New Testament scholar of the 20th century. And his take on this parable, he said, this parable is incomprehensible. But you have me this morning. So, no, I'm kidding. Look, at the end of the sermon this morning, you will not be satisfied with my explanation, probably. You will have unanswered questions. That's good. That is what parables are meant to do, and I'm not an expert, but I'm very excited to look at this very interesting parable with y'all. And before we jump in, just to set a little bit of context, our text this morning is going to begin in the middle of a series of teachings on Jesus' part. He's teaching his disciples, but he's not just teaching the 12 that we think of. Luke 15, verses 1 and 2 give us sort of the scene. It says this. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. This is the second time in the book of Luke, if you were reading it through, that you will see the Pharisees grumble and mutter about this behavior on Jesus' part. It's a pattern for him, and it's a pattern for them. And Jesus is speaking to two audiences at once. The first is his disciples, right? And they range from the merely curious to the fully committed, and they include people from the lowest tranches of society. And the second part of his audience is the higher-ups of the religious order, right? The Pharisees. They're experts in the Jewish law. They know the scriptures backward and forward. They run all the synagogues and all the schools, and they're very concerned about maintaining the integrity of their faith and their religion, just like many of us are. And they're suspicious of the tax collectors and sinners, and they're suspicious of this rabbi who calls them his friends. And so knowing that they're listening in on this conversation, Jesus begins a series of teachings. And he tells three parables, three very famous parables. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal son, which you also might hear called the parable of the lost son or the lost sons. And those three parables are all linked together by a common theme. They're linked together by this theme. It's the joy of having found something that was lost. And they're all about celebration. And so people tend to think of these three parables as sort of a trio. But they're actually the first three in a set of four parables. And the fourth gets overlooked and forgotten about because it's like a little different. It's like the Ringo Starr of this quartet of parables. It's the odd one out. No one thinks it's as good as the other three. And it doesn't follow this lost-found celebration pattern, so it gets left off. So if you read Luke 15 and stop at the end of the chapter, right after the story of the prodigal son, then you haven't read all the way to the end of the conversation. And if you try and pick up this morning's parable in Luke 16 without going all the way back to the beginning of Luke 15, then you're basically guaranteed to miss the point of it. Because there's another common theme linking all these parables that doesn't just link the first three, it shoots straight into the fourth. They all have to do with money. And specifically, they all have to do with wastefulness. A shepherd abandons 99% of the assets to save 1%. That doesn't make sense. It's irresponsible. It's wasteful. It's foolish. It's not what shepherds who are good at their jobs do. A woman has 10 silver coins and she loses one, and she's so intent on finding it right now that she lights an oil lamp to search in the dark. Lamp oil is not cheap. She's burning money to look for one coin. Why can't she just wait until morning? It doesn't make sense. It's wasteful. The prodigal son wants his inheritance early, and when the father gives it to him, he goes and he squanders it all. He was foolish and wasteful. The father was wasteful to give it to him. But it gets worse. Because when the son comes home, the father receives him back into the family, throws him an extravagant party, and writes him back into the will. And the father is the truly wasteful one in the story, not the son. And we're going to be teaching a sermon series through those three parables exactly like a year from now, starting August 1st, 2027, so stick around. Today, let's just remember that context. Tax collectors and sinners are drawing near to Jesus. He welcomes them. They're his friends. The religious leaders don't like that one bit. And Jesus has just told these three parables about people being reckless and wasteful with money. This morning's parable has been called the parable of the dishonest manager, or the unjust manager, or the shrewd manager. I'm going to read it for us and then we'll jump in. So if you're able, please stand to honor God's word. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. This is the word of the Lord. Go ahead and have a seat. You can see why people find this parable perplexing. Like it seems like Jesus is making a positive example out of someone who's like incompetent at best, and maybe just straight up dishonest and plain deceitful. How does that make sense? Like, what kind of value system is operating within this parable? And what is that supposed to teach us about God and about ourselves? We're going to walk through it together, starting here in verse 1. Let's talk about this manager and his master and their relationship. Managers would live in the house and manage the property and the assets on behalf of the master. Maybe this was a slave who grew up in the household. And they had the responsibility and the authority to do business on behalf of the master. They would go out into the community and they would act as the master's agent in business, and they would make deals. And everything that they did on the master's behalf was legally binding. And being a manager in a wealthy home like this was actually an enviable status. Like so much so that free men would sell themselves into this line of work as a means of social promotion. And a third party has come in and has accused the manager of wasting the master's possessions. That's the word, wasting. And it's the same word that is used in the previous chapter, in the previous parable, to describe what the prodigal son does with his inheritance. Diascorpizon, he wastes it, he squanders it. The difference is that in this instance, the wasteful one isn't wasting his own possessions, he's being wasteful of the master's. And so the master calls him in, verse 2. And asked him, "What's this I hear about you? Give the account of your management, and you can't be the manager any longer." So hey, as soon as you finish closing the books, you turn in your keys and get out. You're done. No investigation. We don't know from the story whether this accusation is even true. But the manager is nevertheless put out and finds himself in a moment of serious crisis. Verse 3, he says to himself, like, what am I going to do now? My master's taken away I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. Have you ever found yourself in a jam like this? And many of you know how it feels to lose your job and I have no idea what I'm going to do next. And sometimes desperation can lead to inspiration. And that's what happens for this manager. He hatches the plan, the brilliant plan in verse 4. And he says, I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job, people will welcome me into their homes. We'll get to the plan, but just take a minute to appreciate the bind that he's in. This manager has made his living as the business manager for this wealthy man. He's had status in the society. He's had power and authority and agency. And part of his job was to be the debt collector. And so how do you think the debtors feel about this guy? Do you think they like to see him coming up the driveway? No. The only relational capital he has with them is borrowed because he's the manager. It's all connected to the master. As soon as he is not the manager anymore, he has no more capital with these debtors. And how will they treat him now that he has no authority? They'll have no obligation to respect him. They'll have no reason to help him. They're not going to forget all the times that he came knocking and hounding them for payment. This man has been stripped of his position. He's been stripped of his power. He's been stripped of his status. He's been humiliated. He's fallen all the way down to the bottom. Debtors were low in the social hierarchy, and now he's at least as low as them, if not lower. And he's left with nothing except for his own wits. And so he executes the plan. He called in each one of his master's debtors, verse 5, and asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. 900 gallons of olive oil is the yield of 150 olive trees. It's a massive, massive amount of olive oil. In financial terms, 900 gallons of oil is worth like 3 years' wages for the average worker. And so when he says, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450, he's knocking like 1.5 to 2 years off this person's debt. It's huge. Verse 7, he calls the next one in. And you get the impression that he's done this with many people. He calls in each one, this one, this one, this one. He asks the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. 1,000 bushels of wheat is the yield of about 100 acres of farmland. It's enough to feed 150 people for a year. And in financial terms, it's the equivalent of 7.5 years' wages for the average worker. So once again, he's knocked a couple years off of someone's debt. And it seems like he's being a little arbitrary, because the first guy gets 50%, the second guy gets 20%. But in each case, he's kind of cutting the debt down by about the same figure. It's about 500 denarii, just over 2 years' wages. And the debtors probably love it, right? Because he's cutting years off their debts. I mean, you got to think that his plan is going to succeed. If he's trying to gain favor with these people by slashing the debt so that maybe, just maybe, they'll do him a favor. Maybe they'll let him crash on the couch. Maybe they'll hook him up with a gig. The debtors probably love it. He's cutting off years. But how will the master feel when he finds out that, like, instead of making a full accounting and closing the books, the manager went around slashing people's debts, and now the rich master has to settle for pennies on the dollar? You would expect him to be very upset. He was upset enough at the suggestion that his money was being wasted to fire the guy without hearing him out at all. But look how the master reacts in verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Incredible. Like, moments ago, the master was an upright tyrant, and now he's this fun-loving guy? Like, he was ready to put this low-life manager out on the street. He fired him at the mere mention of impropriety, and now he's making this guy employee of the month, and he's bringing him up on stage, and he's like in front of the whole company, and he's telling the story, and he's shaking his hand, and he's giving him a $100 gift card to Texas Roadhouse. And Jesus says, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. The people of the light means the Jewish people generally. It's aimed kind of sideways at the Pharisees in this moment. I think it applies to all of God's people broadly. And here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, the people of the world understand the rules of the world's game better than God's people understand the rules of God's game. Look at the people who don't know God, and look at how diligently they're going about trying to guard their earthly well-being. And then look at people who do know God, who believe in a heavenly future, and marvel at how they fail to assess the long-term effects of their actions. People who don't know God work so hard. They're relentless in the quest to attain the protection and the prosperity that money promises. And the point that Jesus is making here is that that's how the people of God ought to be about working to honor and please Him. He's going to make a few quick points now about the right way to think about wealth and how to use your money. And I'm going to go through them quickly because they're in here, but they're not actually the point of the parable. We're going to talk about them, but they're not the point. It's very easy to miss the forest for the trees in this parable, and if we get fixated on applying the money teachings, we're going to miss the point. But here's the money teaching. The first is that you should be generous. You should be generous with your money. He says in verse 9, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus has a lot to say in the Gospels about being generous. Right? Money has basically no value to Jesus in and of itself. He could care less about having money. He said, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He doesn't have a value for money, and he sees the future of money, right? He says, when it's gone, money belongs to this world. It doesn't belong to the kingdom of God. Your net worth will accomplish nothing for you in the next life. And so in Jesus' mind, The wisest and best thing that you can do with your money is to give it away for the good of the kingdom and invest it in things that will last, like give it to the poor and use it to show hospitality and use it to serve God and use it to gain friends. And if you want to gain friends, you have to be actually generous, like not transactionally generous. If you throw money around in relationships and try and manufacture friendship or loyalty, or like you give money with strings attached, eventually you're just going to alienate people because people will see through that and they'll feel manipulated. But if you give freely, then you leave the lane open for the other person to respond freely in friendship. The first point is that we're to be generous with our money. The second point about the money is that we should be faithful with money and faithful in stewardship. He says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you the property of your own? So character is character, whether it has to do with something small or something big. Right? No compartmentalizations allowed. Who you are is who you are. And all of your activities and actions in the world reveal the nature of your character to the world. Whether we're talking about an area of responsibility that's small or big doesn't really matter from a moral standpoint. Like, faithfulness is faithfulness at level 1 and at level 10. And we're called to be faithful with money and in stewardship. And the third point is that we should serve God and not possessions. He says very, very, very straightforward. No one can serve two masters. You'll hate the one and love the other. You'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. And you can't serve God and money. It's so interesting that, like, even though money has basically no value to Jesus, he holds it up as the only real competitor to God in the spiritual life. It's not the devil. The devil has nothing on money. In the competition for the allegiance of your heart, the devil is like a 3 seed at best. He has to work to do what money can do, and money doesn't even really do anything. It doesn't promise anything. We just project promises onto it by pinning our hopes on it. We put our trust in money to provide for all of our wants and our needs, and we enshrine it as like the very substance of our lives. And you might say, well, that's the devil tempting me to think that way about money. And you might be right, but Jesus' assessment seems to be that just about everybody is enough of a sinner that all money has to do to get the upper hand on you is just sit in your bank account long enough. Now, these are 3 very strong teachings about money, and yet none of them are the point of the parable. None of these are actually the point of the parable. It's not actually about money. Jesus didn't tell this parable to make a point about money. Don't forget the context. Don't forget who he's talking to. Let's look back at Luke 15, the first 2 verses again. The tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus told this parable as a defense of his ministry to sinners, because he was going around slashing debts, and he was going around forgiving sins. And how did the Pharisees react? Verse 14 of our chapter tells us, right after he says you can't serve God and money, here's how the Pharisees react. It says, the Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. They ridiculed him. They get stuck on the money part, and they miss the point. And so he says to them in verse 15, you're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. And what people value highly is detestable in God's sight. And that is what the entire parable has been about. It's what the 3 parables in the previous chapter are about too. The point is that God operates on a different value system than you do. His definition of righteousness does not match yours. His definition of wisdom doesn't match yours. His definition of goodness does not match yours. The dishonest manager ends up with the master's approval. And who is the dishonest manager? In this story, the dishonest manager is accused of being wasteful with the master's resources. He's humiliated. He loses all of his status. He's completely disempowered. Narratively speaking, he dies. He becomes a shady person to make friends with the other shady people. He rises from death figuratively and raises others with him by slashing the debts, and he's commended by the master. Who's the dishonest manager? Jesus Christ humbled himself. He became a sinner to win sinners. He became sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He died on the cross and rose from the grave, and in his rising, he raises others with him. He said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. He's accused of being wasteful with the master's resources. The Pharisees grumbled that he was too gracious, that he was relaxing the standards too much, that he was playing it fast and loose with God's law. And in the end, he's vindicated by the Father. It's what Paul reminds us of in Philippians 2. Is that even though Jesus was in very nature God, he didn't consider his equality with God a thing to be used to his own advantage. He emptied himself and made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant and being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has exalted him to the highest place and has given him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus Christ is the dishonest manager who is slashing debts left and right. He does not care about money or status or prestige or reputation or any of these other things that we value so highly. What we value highly is detestable to God. Jesus cares about making friends by any means necessary. And he won't allow his mission of grace to be derailed by respectability or standards or strict justice. And if that seems wrong to you, it's because your sense of justice is guided by something besides Jesus' ministry. If you think Jesus shouldn't be the dishonest manager, if you think he shouldn't be gracious, then you know exactly how the Pharisees feel. And you're too committed to a system of right and wrong that Jesus just does not care about. When you read through the Gospel of Luke and watch the way he treats people and pay attention to who he's dealing with,